Hello everyone, and welcome to part 7, where we look at King David. King David is an amazing charismatic figure. We met him as a fugitive at the end of the second book of Samuel when he's being harassed and chased by King Saul. The end of that book, King Saul is dead, and David then struggles at first to become the king. He was to consolidate the tribes, and rather than being just a collection of tribes, they became a nation. As we shall see as we go through, that was no easy task. David expanded his territory through military victories and through making alliances with other kings who saw that he was the rising star and decided to make friends. And so Israel, as the nation began to be called, was the largest it was ever going to be in the whole of history. He also moves his capital very judiciously to Jerusalem, and we'll look at why he did that. He faced and overcame many problems, both nationally and family-wise. Like all Oriental kings, he had more than one wife, and so he had many children by his different wives, and that caused so much grief to him throughout his long life. He was to be king of Israel for 40 years, and it is looked upon as the golden age of the nation. So let us begin. Most of what we know about David comes from the second book of Samuel. Though the account begins in the first book of Samuel with his time before King Saul's death and ends at the first book of Kings with David's death, we have the bulk of what we know about David from this second book of Samuel. In chapter 1, David learns of Saul's death and he mourns him, he laments him. In chapters 2 to 4, David is made king of Judah. Now, there is a period when the northern tribes, called Israel at this time, made Ishbosheth king, who was the son of Saul. But Ishbosheth is murdered shortly after that, and then the northern tribe come to David and ask for him to be their king too. In chapter 5, David very astutely becomes the king of both Judah and Israel, but he moves his capital from Hebron to Jerusalem. We shall learn more about that later, why he does that. To consolidate Jerusalem as the centre of his kingdom, the ark, which has been languishing somewhere else, is brought to Jerusalem. He constructs a tent for it, and worship begins to be in Jerusalem, and there the centre stays. Of course, at this point there is much problems from the Philistines. The map that you see here is at the end of David's reign, when the Philistines really have been quelled and their territory has shrunk to a tiny amount. But the defeats begin in chapter 8. In chapter 9 we have the story of David with Mephibosheth. Now Mephibosheth was the only surviving son of King Saul. All the rest had been murdered. But he was a cripple, and that's why he'd escaped. But David brings him into the palace and treats him royally. In chapter 10, there is a very significant defeat of the Ammonites, who were in the south, and the Syrians in the north. And David is able to take their territory into his, and that's why there is such a stretch of Israel's territory by that point. In chapters 11 or 12, we have the shameful episode of David with Bathsheba, and out of this is born Solomon, who was destined to become the king after David. Again, another shameful incident in chapters 13 and 14 between Amnon and Tamar, and we meet another son of David, Absalom. Now, Absalom bore a grudge, a grievance, a chip on his shoulder, and by chapter 15 to 17, Absalom rebels and drives David out of Jerusalem, and David goes into exile. Absalom's rebellion, and that's what it was, is defeated in chapter 18, and the aftermath is that David goes into mourning. The famous phrase, "Absalom, my son, oh Absalom, Absalom, my son." He's devastated over the defeat of Absalom, over his death, sorry. And there is further rebellion in chapters 20, 21a from Saul's family. So David is never, ever really settled and comfortable. There's always some trouble going on somewhere. But in chapter 22, we have that decisive defeat of the Philistines. And in chapter 23, 24, David's final acts brings the book of 2 Samuel to an end. The first book of Chronicles is from the priestly source, so its focus is on temple worship and doing things properly, and therefore there are a lot of lists there of genealogies so that the right people, the people who come from the pure line, can be taking part in temple worship. And so it covers certain sections. It is probably a much later document, though it uses some of the material from 2 Samuel, and I've set it out on this page for those who are interested. Timeline, well, we're about 1020 BC, so we're 1,000 years away from Abraham. When you think about that, that's an awful long period, and things have been developing and changing. We can get to more precise times. We know that David died in 961, and we know that from archaeological evidence, among other things. The wider world background, well, the situation hasn't changed very much since the children of Israel first entered. The dominant powers are the Ammonites and the Syrians, and of course the Philistines, and they are subjugated in David's reign. Egypt is still very weak, and the northern powers are still consolidating. We'll hear a lot about the Assyrians in future sections, but at this point there's still no threat. And so David is able to found his kingdom with some stability. David was a remarkable man. As I've set out here, he had immense personal courage, was a great military commander, a very astute politician. He was adored by the women of Israel, but he could also be humble. It happened over Absalom. He also could be kind and forgiving, the way he dealt with Mephibosheth. His influence on the nation cannot be underestimated. You talk to any Jewish person today and they will talk glowingly about David. He's the pinnacle of their aspirations, and they hope that they will one day have another David in his place. Though of course as Christians we believe that David has come again I will explain that. All was never plain sailing for him. He never knew peace, either from enemies or from the intrigues of his many sons. Towards the end of his life, as I said, he was temporarily usurped by Absalom. His humble response was to go into exile. And when Absalom was killed, he mourned his death. A remarkable man, the like of whom Israel was never to see again, except in their true eternal King, Jesus himself. Another facet of the genius of David is his musicianship and his gift of poetry. David, of course, came to the notice of Saul, and not just for his military prowess, but because he was a gifted harpist and could calm Saul down during his bouts of madness. As time went on and David became king, he is credited with setting up the singing for worship in the tent, and then eventually under Solomon's reign, the temple. Here we have a quotation from 1 Chronicles. Of course, these wonderful psalms of lament, of praise, are still sung today, either in their translations or in paraphrases. And you go to any synagogue, cathedral, or many of the parish churches that have a choral tradition, and these psalms will be sung. Anglican clergy should say a daily office, morning and evening, in which they will go through the psalm book month by month. Now, I just want to explain a little bit about Judah and Israel, because it will become very important as these sections go on. It seems that in Judges that Judah, along with Simeon, were to be the spearhead of the conquest of Canaan, and they did it as God had commanded. But the rest of the tribes rather assimilated. They made compromises, and that led very much to them taking on the idols and the worship of the gods around them, the Baals, and that angered God. So there was always that kind of friction. They looked on Judah as being the goody-goody boys, and that set some seeds for the future. So after the death of Saul, this division became even more apparent, with the northern tribes appointing Ishbosheth as their king, whereas Judah saw David as their king. But he was able to get over that. He was able to bridge that gap, heal the rift by his actions, and that unity continued through his reign and through the reign of Solomon, but didn't last any longer than that. It's very important to see why David chose Jerusalem. Jerusalem was an unconquered city-state in the middle. We first meet it in Genesis chapter 14, when Abraham meets Melchizedek, who is both king of Salem and priest of God Most High. By David's time, the city was called Jebus, and so you've got the two things. Salem, Jebus became Jerusalem. David decided very wisely that he would found a new capital, which was neither north nor south, neither Israel nor Judah, was on neutral territory, and so he chose and conquered Jerusalem. And to consolidate Jerusalem as his capital, he brought the Ark of the Covenant to the city. He wanted to build a temple for God, but God said he was a man with blood on his hands, and that the temple would be built by his son Solomon. But anyway, David started to gather materials, cedar from Lebanon, stone, the best stone that he could find, gold, silver, bronze, copper, in huge quantities for the building of this magnificent temple. Pointers to Jesus are quite few because, of course, as time went on, people began to look for this Son of David figure, who would be the one who would lead them back into the glorious time that they'd experienced under David. This figure began to consolidate into who we know as the Messiah figure. But there was a problem. And the problem was that the line of David had been severed in 568. Though David had been promised that one of his descendants would be on the throne of the kingdom forever, your dynasty will never end, the dynasty had seemed to end. But Isaiah, later on, some centuries later, gave a prophecy. The royal line of David is like a tree that has been cut down, but just as new branches sprout from a stump, so a new king will arise from among David's descendants. The Spirit of the Lord will give him wisdom and the knowledge and skill to rule his people. He will know the Lord's will and honour him, and find pleasure in obeying him. He will not judge by appearance or hearsay. So the stump was there, but there will be a branch that will grow out of it. The symbolism being a stump of a tree and a branch growing out from the stump. Though the trunk's been cut off, the tree's not dead. And that was a hope. So they looked for this Son of David. The Gospels have several accounts of people, particularly the ones who've been healed, calling Jesus Son of David, who saw in Jesus something of that Messiah that they were looking for. But of course the authorities rejected that. Another prophecy pointing to Jesus comes from the prophet Micah. The Lord says, Bethlehem, Ephrathah, you are one of the smallest towns in Judah, but out of you I will bring a ruler for Israel, whose family goes back to ancient times. Of course, Bethlehem is the city of David. And if you look at the genealogies at the beginning of the two Gospels of Matthew and Luke, in those genealogies, they trace back Jesus' human lineage back to King David. And so it's important that the Messiah comes from Bethlehem. And of course we have the account in the Gospels that because of the Roman census, Mary and Joseph had to go to Bethlehem, where Joseph came from, and of course that's where Jesus was born. So he was born in Bethlehem. As the well-known carol puts it, to you in David's town this day is born of David's line a Saviour who is Christ the Lord, and this shall be the sign. So in the eternal kingship of Jesus, we have the perfect fulfillment of the promise of David. Davidic connection is also implied, of course, in the title Shepherd. David was a shepherd boy. He was called the Shepherd of Israel. And of course, the New Testament, Jesus is called the Good Shepherd. And in fact, Jesus, in John's Gospel, calls himself the Good Shepherd. And so we have come to the end of David's reign. And in section 8, we will look at Solomon and the building of the temple in Jerusalem. Thank you.